That's it? Okay. Good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for inviting me to comment on Howie's paper. I, no. Yeah. What I want to focus my discussion is in 3 points. I want to discuss the particular, as I see, the particular contribution of the paper to the issue being discussed today. I would like to discuss and to add a little bit to the challenges as I see them of the Israeli society, just to put, because I think that they assist us in framing the issues that we have been discussing. And finally, I want to draw some attention to the need for further data and research. Howie's paper really focus on the worries, economic worries of those older segments in the population. That is the subjective perception of the elderly, of their situation, and how this is translated into feelings and expectations for the future. I thought that the seminar general issue was framed Program for Pension Planning and Social Security, planning and socio-economic security. And when we say economic security, this can be really understood as we have been discussing the whole morning. It's in some thinking about some absolute figures, absolute numbers of that people have to meet their ends. But I think that it also must be understood in how people interpret the feelings of security, and really feelings of the opposite of feeling of security is feeling economic vulnerability, and therefore being worried, as the Howie's paper focuses on. I think that as much as a third, as you said, of the population in your study presented some degree of a little bit more than a third presented the economic worry, and that as I read in your paper, the most important component was the worry about that the pensions will not be sufficient for the entire life, and we were discussing this life expectancy issues. And I think that it was already mentioned this morning, but I think it's very important to this particular finding, is that the change in the law since 2008, by which money, the deposits into any of the pension funds cannot be used as and obtained as capital, but only as a monthly pension for the entire life, can take, I think it's a really good measure that can, it's also, I think, a good measure in general, but also it makes people feel much more secure in this market of uncertainty that you were discussing before. I think also that one of the significant findings of the study, and also of the literature that you review, and it's not surprising, I don't think, not only to me, but not to you either, is that there is a strong correlation between the appraisal of the present economic situation and worries about the future. As I will mention later, we do not have rigorous and good data on the impact of aging on the economic situation of individuals, especially with regards to meeting one's needs and expectations. I think that subjective measures, as the ones you presented today, have a value in itself, because they provide individuals' interpretation of the situation, which in the end is a major factor in affecting the quality of life. You also noted that, and there are other findings that, as the ones you presented today, that the younger groups tend to feel less, older groups tend to feel less worried than the younger groups. And you also offered some explanations for that, and they were really nice, but I want to add at least two more. One is the cohort effect, and we have been finding that, and I think that we do not give enough attention to cohort effects when we are talking about the population 65 and over. That means 65 to 120. These are completely different groups, different experiences, and I think that there are really important cohort difference among them. I think that maybe different cohorts expect different things about what they need in their lives, and their expectations are different. Maybe all these cohorts have less expectations and of their standard of living, of what they need. Need is a very subjective thing too. And I think also that we can think that there's a cohort difference between, with regard to the trust and the feelings of people towards the government, family, and society. And I can throw my hypothesis that all the segments in the society feel more trust and on the family and on the government, that they will receive, their needs will be addressed more than younger cohorts. But in addition, I think I found that the Central Bureau of Statistics in the social survey also asked in 2009 a question about the economic situation, how people perceive the economic situation in the future. And I found it very interesting that it goes that the younger people tend to think, if you can see here, much more younger people think that the economic situation will improve. And in the older segments in the society, those that are 65 to 74 and 75, and especially those at the age of 75, feel that the economic situation will not change. So that goes a little bit around the stability of the thinking of the older segments of the society. I think that also you found a significant correlate of the financial worry that is the apprehension regarding one's ability to make decisions. And your interpretation, I think your interpretation is very interesting in that that it may reflect a concern of financial literacy in an increasingly complicated financial market, and I think that deserves much more thinking about policy implications. I think also it's important to mention here that another source of worries for the elderly in Israel is that and it was a little bit mentioned this morning, and I want to reinforce that, is that Israeli elderly, those 65 and over, still care for economically and provide support to their children. And as about 35% of those 65 and over provides economic support to the children, which is, I think, very high, and it's very particular to the Israeli society. But interesting as well is that 20% of those 65 and over give help to their parents. And that is part of the longevity. They will have multi-generations, and then we find a cohort of people, most of them will be in the 65 to 74. They're not working, they're not in the labor, most of them are not in the labor market, I will show you that. And still they have to provide some kind of support, or providing some support to the children and to their parents. So I think it's very, and you can understand in the background of that some of the worries. Let me go really quickly just to annoy you on some of the data because I think it's important to put it in the table. And I will go quickly, so some data I think is important. First of all, you can see in this graph is the aging of the Israeli society since 1960, and projections only to 2030. And what you can see here is very interesting. The Israeli society aged very fast during the 60s to the 80s. And it was very challenging at that time. Then we have about 3 decades that the absolute numbers were increasing, but not the proportion of the elderly in the society. It's only now that we again face an increase in the proportion of the elderly. And I think that that's one of the reasons why there's so much concern in Israel and much more talking than in the past about aging and definitely about the implications of aging. This will really annoy you. This is the dependency ratios. And I think that the only point I want to make here is that, yes, we are a young society, even if we are aging, but the challenges in Israel are very high because even if we're aging, the proportion of the elder here in Israel are less than in other countries, we are leading in total dependency ratio, which I think it's very challenging among other things that Israel has. And this, I think, it's very important to understand the worries of the elderly in Israel. These are the sources of income, okay, of the elderly in Israel. And you can see here that the most of the, the first pillar, which is old age allowances, very small other governmental supports. Occupational pension is the red one. Work is the blue one, and other, the purple. You can see, and I think it's very particular to our society, that almost 40%, the two quintiles at the lowest quintiles depend almost only on social security transfers or governmental transfers. So any changes, any or a little bit of inflation at that time that the social security pension does not keep up with it, which it happens. Okay, so it's a very significant to a very significant proportion of elderly. I think another thing that it was also discussed here this morning, and you can see it very clear here, is the high inequality among the elderly. Okay, you can see the highest quintile, which of course is composed of, they have much more sources of income, of course, but also the inequalities, and it wasn't mentioned today, but I think that it's important to say that the inequalities among the elderly are higher than the inequalities in the total population in Israel. Here is only the percentage of people receiving occupational pension, as you see. Only a third of those that are 65 and over today receive an occupational pension. 12 are in the labor market. So it leaves us with a very high proportion of without what we call economical earnings and dependent on Social Security. And this, I think, I bring this slide because I think if I had the time, I would discuss it much more thoroughly. But I don't know if when you come from abroad, you realize that Israel is very current cohort of elderly were not born in Israel, and only 24% were born here. And as you see, the 24% is divided between two completely different groups. 8% of them are the Arab Israelis, and only 60% are Jews that were born here. Then we have almost a quarter of those that came and immigrated from the former Soviet Union since 1990, which they are about a fourth of the population. And then we have what we call the veteran Jews that are completely different also among them. And here are other groups, but the heterogeneity is tremendous. We have people that came from Eastern Europe, and we have those that came from Asia, Africa. There's no other country in the world that faces this kind of situation. What is important and relevant, it has a lot of implications for many things. But among the things that I wanted to bring this into the table today is because this explains, at least partially, the economic situation of the elderly in Israel. If it's the elderly that they were not born here, they came to Israel at different ages. Many of them never were integrated into the labor market. Those that were integrated in the labor market, until very recently, there was not an obligatory pension obligatory pension system. Therefore, many of people coming from abroad just were working in works that they didn't have any pension agreement. And those that did, many of them work for very few years. So they don't have enough seniority, so the pension is very small. So part of the poverty that is being discussed all the time in Israel among the elderly is explained by the fact that these people came mostly from other countries and that 4 of them are even new immigrants. And lastly, the last point that I wanted to make is that I think that we really have few data on the impact of aging on the economic situation and the economic security. We don't really have good data, longitudinal data, following people from adulthood, not 2-3 years, that is really not enough to fully understand what is the real changes in income, what are the trajectories, what impacts those trajectories in the impact. We don't have good data on the changes in expenditure, which expenditures remain the same, which tend to increase, which tend to decrease. How we just mentioned in your summary that, or at the beginning, that many of the elderly today with this active life, active paradigm, maybe increases our expectations for, and then that can increase the expenses. So I don't think that we have good data, definitely. And I think that that point you also mentioned in the paper, less you mentioned in the presentation, but you mentioned it in your paper, is the expected, actually the unexpected and the catastrophic expenditures such as long-term care. And I define catastrophic expenditures as expenditures that are relatively high to income. But the second component, that's not enough, because we find in our lives many times that we have expenditures that are higher than our income. But here we find a situation that we do not know if we are going to need it, when we are not going to need it, and for how long. So I always compare it like with, I'm finishing. I always compare it with marrying a children. Judith is marrying her son next week. It's a very, it can be a very high expenditure, but in terms of planning, you have the instruments to plan. You know almost when it's going to happen. You hope that it will happen, and most of the time it happens. You almost have an idea when it's going to happen, and you really hope that it's only once. But you always... So it's a different situation with regard to health and long-term care. So I think that behind all these worries of the elderly. Thank you.
Thank you. If you have questions.
Just about the heterogeneity you mentioned about poverty, I think you're completely correct about this. It's a very important point why Israel has such high poverty. But I must disappoint you a little bit, because when we analyze poverty, very much of the poverty is in the young age groups, and there we have less heterogeneity. And in the old age group, it depends how you look at poverty. If you look at consumption poverty, or at as do the Canadians and also the Americans, not the absolute poverty, but the what we call it NRC, National Research Council of the National Academy of Science in the US, where they wrote an important book about measuring poverty. We did the same exercise for Israel, not exactly the same, because I'm not able to do always the same. It has to be a little different. But still we see then, if we include, for example, imputed income for housing, for living in your own house, so the old age poverty in Israel drops tremendously. And this is, I think, a very important point. So what we really and the overall poverty is still higher than in the national insurance accounts. So what it means is that the poor people in Israel are not so much the old, although in our statistics they appear severe. And there, I think, is the heterogeneity.
Following up on that, how long do you have to participate in the labor force to qualify for national insurance, the Social Security retirement benefit?
You don't have to be working in the labor market. All you have to be is to be insured. You are insured. If you are a man, you are insured whether you work or whether you don't work, whether you pay or whether you don't pay. If you are a woman, it's not as easy, because women, if they are called so-called housewives, they are not really insured, which I think is a discrimination, but it's difficult to change.
Oh, Danny, the law changed.
No. Don't teach me that. We don't have time. But it is...
They can insure.
No, they are insured. No, they are insured. They are half insured for old age and for disability. There is also a difference. So it is a problem. It's not a huge problem, but you don't have to be working. In order to get a pension from work, you have to be working. But in order to have the basic income from Social Security, you have to be insured, which is a different thing. If you are studying the Bible in a yeshiva, then you will be insured on what's called a minimal basis. This is what I was mentioning about the discrimination. This is still the case. Okay.
But I think that also, I don't know if you also wanted to know about new immigrants. New immigrants are insured from the moment that they come to Israel. Okay, and this is not in an insurance base. That money comes from Treasury, from the Ministry of Finance. They receive the same money, the same thing. I don't think that they even realize that it's not Social Security paying them. But they have exactly the same rights. They have health insurance, long-term care insurance, pension insurance the moment they come to Israel. So they don't have to work here.
And given the importance of the Social Security benefits for the bottom two quintiles, have you studied by how much that would have to be increased to eradicate poverty among the elderly?
This is a good question, but if we look at the payment, it is relatively to other benefits, it's one of the higher payments of the old age, and it's not very clear why, nevertheless, we have so much poverty among the old age. So it's a good question, and I don't have a good answer.
I found this fascinating, that obviously the less worried, despite much less resources, are those oldest old, 75 plus, the Russian immigrants. Then you said, I'm not sure, older people generally worry less. This would be quite a puzzling and paradoxical situation. There's a book by Dan Greenberg, not the one about how to be a Jewish mother, but how to make yourself miserable. A wonderful book. And it's basically this paradoxical interventions. If you're old and frail and poor and isolated, it's easy to be unhappy. But if you're young and rich and beautiful, how to make yourself miserable nevertheless? And he gives very nice suggestions of how to do this. So maybe there's something in this. Because the phenomenon we also find across Europe, that not those most in need, but those most complaining are not necessarily those most in need. And it may not be the Soviet man, but there may be other. And, Jenny gave some indications about the cohort, the generational effect. Does it change with age? Once you are wise and old enough, you become less passionate about complaining, or is it a generational phenomenon? We don't know. The one on the dependency ratios, I think that's a very good point you made about the dependency ratio may overall be increasing or going down for some decades. And the question is it the youth and old age dependency ratio? And I think even with the same overall dependency ratios, when does the youth and the old dependency ratio cross? And this is, in some countries like Italy, 80 years before Turkey or Israel. So actually you have the same phenomenon, macroeconomically speaking, but a totally different microdynamics below this. And I think this is maybe a good marker of not economic problems, but of the composition of the groups who may have reasons to complain, and why have the young more reason to complain in Israel than in other countries. So I think that maybe some of the puzzles.
Okay, I think I'm supposed to respond. There isn't too much to respond to. I just that we correct. Yeah, the coffee's waiting. We correctly noticed that the topic of my paper was the subjective reaction, and with some subjective measures, with the clear indication that subjectivity influences quality of life. And these are all independent factors from neediness and actual dependency and so forth and so on. So the inevitable aspiration of the economist to describe those underlying mechanisms of causality is not really what's at the point here. The point here is what's making people feel like they feel, and how does that affect their subjective well-being in the end. And the interesting thing is indeed that the people who are objectively worse off don't necessarily worry. So there's something about worrying. And the connection to this topic, though, is that the financial worry might be an underlying reason for choosing when to retire. And that's how we can hook back in to the conference theme. Thank you.